comes to really optimizing color. And beyond that, I'm more than happy to, well, talk about some of the other new features that aren't necessarily related to color or that aren't necessarily related to optimizing images at all, if there's an interest in that. And more than happy to take questions or requests from all of you. This is your presentation, so feel free to jump in and boss me around a little bit if you're so inclined, or ask questions. More than happy to address any questions, or go off on tangents if that's what we're in the mood for. But I'll go ahead and share my screen here. There we go. Perfect. All right, looks like we're in business. So let's go ahead and dive in to Lightroom Classic. And I do want to mention right from the start, in fact, let's just jump over into that as well. Go take a look at a photo here, just a sample image. And I'm going to bring this into Photoshop the old-fashioned way to make sure it opens in the right version. There we go. And so I'm going to be talking primarily about Lightroom Classic and not talking about the cloud-based version of Lightroom. There was a comment earlier about, potentially the option of Lightroom that had been cloud-based. Now it's just cloud-focused. It's frankly not a version of Lightroom that I recommend. I think, it's Lightroom Classic or it's Photoshop or it's something else altogether. In my experience, in my opinion, for most photographers, the cloud-focused version of Lightroom is just not really an optimal choice. But what I'm going to be talking about today would apply for Lightroom and for Camera Raw. And so, for example, here we have Lightroom Classic. So in the context of Lightroom Classic, our adjustments happen in the Develop module, of course, and we have over on the right panel the various sections of adjustments. If I get back over here into Camera Raw, very similar, not identical, but very similar. Mostly there is parity between both versions of Lightroom. Well, I guess I should say more or less all four versions of Lightroom, which would be Lightroom Classic, Lightroom, what I call Lightroom Cloud, but the other desktop application, Lightroom in a web browser, and Lightroom on a mobile device, iPhone or iPad, for example, or Android for that matter. And Camera Raw is essentially the same. So between all the versions of Lightroom and Camera Raw, we used to have essentially total parity. So if you were using the latest version of any of those applications, you had the same adjustments available. That has changed recently. Adobe Camera Raw gets features on a number of occasions, has gotten features before the other versions, usually only by a few months. The idea is that Camera Raw is sort of their mainstay at Adobe. And so when they're launching new features that maybe they're a little nervous about, that's where they're going to put it, there and there alone. And so, for example, in the reflection removal, dust removal, for example, had been launched into Camera Raw before it was available in Lightroom Classic. But with the releases that just came out at Adobe Max, about 2 weeks ago, or whatever the actual date was, that has brought parity back. And so the main point is that if you're using Camera Raw, if you're not a Lightroom Classic person, that's okay. I totally understand that. I've seen a lot of photographers make a mess of Lightroom Classic, so that's understandable. But there is a little bit of difference in terms of the various sections over on the right panel, the naming. So see in Camera Raw, we have light and color, whereas in Lightroom Classic, those are both encapsulated in the basic section. So some differences, but the core features are the same. The behavior is the same. You just might have to dig around a little bit to find the differences, to translate that interface difference. And so if there's anybody who's not using Lightroom Classic, just bear that in mind. There may be some degree of confusion. As long as I'm in Photoshop here, mentioned during the intro, the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter that, yes, shockingly, it's been 24 years now as of November 1st since I started publishing that. Obviously, I started publishing that when I was about 10 years old, and it's been a long time though. And so I'm going to have a webinar on next Monday. That is October the 17th, right? And so you're more than welcome to join in for that as well. It's going to be a question and answer session in the theme of the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter. And so if you point your web browser at timgray.me/webinar 2511, as in November of 2025, There is a registration form. You can sign up there totally free and just get your name on the list so that you'll get the information for that presentation if you are interested. And you can submit questions as part of that as well if you'd like. All right, so let's dive in to Lightroom Classic again. Same basic thing. When we're in the develop module, a little bit of differences in the interface, but it's the same adjustments overall as you'll find in Camera Raw. Just from time to time, you might find some features in Camera Raw that are not available in Lightroom Classic, at least not just yet. But I'm going to start off with some of the basic adjustments. And I find, even when the intent is to show you some of the more sophisticated, advanced color controls, it's still really helpful, at least I think it's really helpful, to revisit some of those basics, especially because there's some nuance to some of these things and confusion, dare I say. I usually ask for a raise of hands if anybody is an Adobe employee, but here on Zoom, with most of you having your cameras turned off, I can't see if that's the case. I'll take my chances that I won't get in trouble in saying that Adobe seems to be interested in trying to confuse us when it comes to the versions of Lightroom to start with, and certainly when it comes to some of the features. Some of the nomenclature can get to be a little bit confusing, and so I'm going to talk about a feature here that has caused a lot of confusion. The intent was good, but the execution maybe has led to some confusion, and that is the profile. So profiles are found on this pop-up over on the right panel in the basics section here in the develop module. They're often confused with presets, but a profile is not the same as a preset. A profile is also not the same, really, as a profile that we would use, same name, but that we would use for printing an image. Very similar in concept, kind of almost used in reverse, you might say. For those of you that are adept at color management, this profile would be sort of like assigning a profile rather than converting to a profile. If that doesn't make sense to you, don't worry. It's just color management nerd stuff. But the profile, I think of this as just a base underlying interpretation of the image. And I think one of the ways that might make it easier to understand that is that to think about the notion of a raw capture not really being a photo and not truly having pixel information. And in fact, a raw capture literally does not have pixel information in the context of an RGB image, for example. It's really just the data that came out of the image sensor, which basically means voltage values that the photodiodes gathered based on how many photons of light struck each of those individual photodiodes during the exposure. You may have noticed I'm a little bit of a nerd, but the point is that it's just data. It's just information that was gathered by the sensor. It needs to be interpreted. And it's going to be interpreted differently by different software. And so Lightroom has its own engine for how it processes that information, and any other software that you can use to process a raw capture, it's going to be a little bit different. You're going to have different adjustments to start with, but even the baseline interpretation of that image data will be different. So if you think about the fact that software has to sort of decide how to interpret the information that came from the camera, that I think makes it a little easier to understand the notion behind these profiles, in that we're just changing the interpretation. So these profiles do not represent a preset, I should say, that is preserving specific adjustment settings. This is a baseline adjustment unto itself. And so when we choose a profile, we're not going
Am I the only one who lost him?
if we
I
Oh,
did.
there he is.
oh,
Oh, there you are.
Oh,
did
wow.
something go?
Yeah, like you blipped out.
Maybe
Oh,
we do
interesting.
have a secret agent for Adobe online. So-
Right. They're trying to silence me. All I know is my window disappeared.
I know it just bleeped out, but you're back.
Interesting. All right. Well, hopefully that won't repeat itself. Otherwise, yes,
Right.
definitely we'll blame Adobe for it.
Yeah.
So yeah, so profile is just a way of changing the underlying baseline interpretation of the pixel data, of the image data, the raw data, by and large. Obviously, we're not only limited to processing raw images, but that's the context where it's most meaningful.
Dan, you
And
may need to reshare your screen. We're not
oh,
seeing your screen
gotcha.
any longer.
Yep. There we go. Yeah, Zoom, Adobe really has control of Zoom now as well, huh?
I guess so.
Giving me trouble. All right, so yeah, so again, that profile, it's a baseline interpretation of the image, and so we can click the profile pop-up. There's some options here that are available. So we can switch. Most of the time, you're going to see fairly subtle little shift in the color. There's also monochrome options. Well, that's adaptive, but black and white, or the Adobe monochrome, which is the default black and white interpretation. And here's a vintage one, which kind of looks like old faded film. So in some cases, it's pretty dramatic. Some cases, pretty subtle. What these originally were designed for is to give you the JPEG look for a raw capture. And what I mean by that is, as I'm sure you're all aware, if you apply adjustments in the camera, if you capture in black and white, you're not actually capturing black and white when it's a raw capture. Or if you boost the saturation or shift the color temperature, all of that's just metadata. And that doesn't make it. Makes it into the JPEG preview that you see on the back of the camera, for example, but it doesn't make it to the raw capture. So, for example, even if you capture in black and white on a color camera, obviously, there are some cameras that do capture specifically in black and white only, but that image is going to snap into color as soon as you get into Lightroom Classic, for example. And so these profiles were originally intended, so landscape from your camera or the portrait option from your camera, so that you could mimic what you would otherwise see for a JPEG capture with your raw files. And then Adobe had to update it, which is not a bad thing, but it's made it more confusing and more flexible. There's also a browse option here, or this button over here to the right, little 4 rectangles there. That's the browse button as well. And then we can go through and take a look at the different sections and choose a profile. And what I generally tell folks is, if none of this seems all that interesting to you and it just seems confusing, no problem, because there's no obligation to actually use the profiles. I don't use them myself, except when I'm teaching. If you do find some that you like here, as an interesting starting point for an image, you can mark it as a favorite. So we can go up to this little star here at the top right and click to turn that on. And favorite means that then we'll be able to see it on that pop-up that we started off with. And so again, if you find options here that look interesting to you, totally cool. If you don't, you can be like me and just always leave that set to not adaptive color, but Adobe color. The adaptive options, by the way, the adaptive in that term means that it changes based on the image. And so you won't always get the same look for different images. It'll adapt based on an analysis of the image. Similar in concept to adaptive presets, but those are really just masking features that are saved as part of a preset. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close that browser for the profile pop-up and move on to what I think are more interesting topics related to adjusting the color. But again, some photographers love these profiles and choose a different profile for every image. I'm not one of those, but if you are, that's cool as well. All right, and then moving on to color, just the basics of color and essentially a color balance adjustment, which for those of us who have been working with computers in photography for a long time, probably familiar with the color balance adjustment that is available in Photoshop, for example, and other applications where we're essentially adjusting RGB sliders. So we have sliders for red, green, and blue, and their opposite colors. And so we're able to shift between red and cyan, blue and yellow, and green and magenta. Well, not in that order. I did them out of order in terms of RGB. But that balance of colors. In Lightroom, we only have the 2 sliders, which I know some photographers think that that's odd that we went from 3 sliders to 2. We must not have as much control. But this is just directions that we're going around the color wheel. And so the idea is, instead of having 3 axes that we can move across the color wheel to shift the tint in the image, the overall color in the image, we're just using 2, but we can still get to the same destination. And those adjustments allow us to shift between, for temperature, blue and yellow, and for tint, the green and magenta axis. This is the same way that the human eye interprets colors, by the way. This is based on lab color, for those of you that might have heard about lab color, used in color management, also used in some creative processes that photographers have made popular over the years. But when it comes to that overall color, that overall balance of color, compensating for the color of light in the image, for example, one of our options is essentially to treat this like our camera and choose a preset. So from the white balance section here, I can go to the pop-up and specify what kind of lighting condition was the image captured in and correct the image accordingly. So if I say, oh, well, it was under tungsten light, an incandescent light, that's a very yellow light source. And so the compensation is going to be to shift toward a blue color value, which obviously is not the correct option here. My feeling is that this is maybe a fine starting point, but the reality is if it was daylight, we still might want to warm up the image a little bit more, make it a little bit more yellow. And so my feeling is I'm likely going to go to the temperature and tint sliders anyway. So why waste time choosing something from the pop-up? So I generally don't, but it is an option. It can give you a good starting point. The other consideration here that is certainly valid is that sometimes seeing the image look wrong makes it easier to figure out what's going to be right. And so if, I tell you, okay, between daylight and cloudy, which one looks better? You might say, well, I don't know. They're pretty close. It doesn't, look dramatically different. Maybe either is fine. But if I go show you a tungsten, you say, okay, that's wildly wrong. More on that concept here in a moment. But generally, I'll just leave this set to as shot. It'll change to custom as soon as I make an adjustment. But that means show me what the camera interpreted, and then I'll take it into a little bit of another direction. The other option that is available is to use the white balance tool, the little eyedropper here in the basic section. So I can just click on that eyedropper to activate it or to grab it essentially. And then I can move out into the image. And the idea is that I want to click on something in the image that should be perfectly neutral gray, which for most photographers ought to ring alarm bells, ought to raise alarm bells, because if an object was gray in the real world, I don't want it looking gray in my photo. That's why I got up for sunrise so I can get some nice golden light, or stayed up for sunset so I could get some nice golden light. Of course, this time of year, don't have to get up all that early or stay up all that late for sunrise and sunset. But the point is, we want golden light, or whatever the case might be in terms of the lighting source. We want that to be a part of the image. The only time for most of us that we might want gray to truly be gray is something like product photography, where you want to show the colors as accurately as possible, as though the subject was illuminated with completely pure white light. But here, this image obviously has a little bit of a pinkish hue to it from the sunrise. If I were to click on the roof of the barn here, which is pretty gray, or on the white trim, then I'm taking away most or all of the color. I'm taking away the reason that I was up at 4 in the morning to get out here for sunrise that happens right about 5 in the morning. So the eyedropper, seems like a good idea, except for the many, many situations where it's not the best starting point. Now, again, you might find that your preference is to neutralize the color and then decide which direction that you want to take the image for. That is, by the way, excuse me, a cinematic approach. In the movie industry, everything is captured, but generally speaking, in most cases, with a very, very flat appearance. And that's where the post-processing color grading comes in to put the colors the way they want them. But for most of us, I think that's not the easiest way to approach. And plus, if you click on the wrong thing, then you'll end up with colors that, don't make a lot of sense. So if I click on a pinkish area, magenta area, that's going to shift toward green. If I click on a green area, it's going to shift toward magenta. Click on red, it's going to take me towards cyan. And so it's easy to click on the wrong thing. So once again, not something I tend to use. It'd be mostly for, again, something like product photography, where I actually do want the color to be perfect, with no color influence from the light that was illuminating the scene. So I'll just put that white balance tool right back where I found it, click into that circle, and maybe switch this back to as shot so we've got better color for that image. But then I'm going to move on to another image just to illustrate a little bit better, I think, the temperature and tint. And so again, those two options, perfectly viable. They can work wonderfully well. You might love them. That's totally fine. I'm on board with that. Whatever works for you is good for me. But my feeling is you're always going to go back and fine tune at least just a little bit the temperature and tint sliders. So in my mind, it just makes the most sense to go directly there. Of course, when I say that, a lot of times photographers will react with, yeah, but I don't know where to go. I don't know how to move those sliders. I don't have a good eye for color, etc. Well, I got a couple tricks here for you that I hope will make that process a little bit easier. The first is to swing these sliders through their extremes. And so, for example, with temperature, the shift between blue and yellow, I think everyone would agree this is too yellow. This is overdone. And if we go in the other direction, this is too blue. And so if we go all the way to the maximum extremes, it's pretty easy to say, well, that's wrong. most of the time, unless it's some odd abstract image where that, may not be quite as clear. But the point is, we swing through those extremes. It's pretty obvious what's bad. The other thing with temperature in particular, this is less true, almost not true when it comes to tint. But for temperature, there's a range of what I call acceptable values, of values that are realistic, believable. This nobody's going to think that this was photographed on a moonlit night or something like that, and nobody's going to think that this is what the sunrise looked like on that particular day, right? But as we get out here into the middle, if I go here, for example, this is pretty warm. There's a lot of yellow there, but you'd probably believe, maybe, depending on how much you trusted me, but you might believe that that was accurate color based on what the scene looked like. Maybe it was foggy, but on the other direction, we had sunrise coming up and it put some nice light onto the fog. It certainly is possible. Similarly, if I come out over here, that's a bit, strong blue, but you might believe that this, was a relatively accurate rendition of the color. The point is that there's this little range that we can find where any of those are acceptable values. And so my suggestion, especially if you don't feel like you have a good eye for color, or you're not sure which direction to take a particular image, is to swing through the extremes, see the bad color, so to speak, and then gradually kind of settle down that dragging where you're not going as wild, as far in either direction. And then try to settle on, what seems to be a reasonable middle ground, so to speak, a value that looks good to you, and then kind of settle in. Now, you might also have a feeling that you're not so good at getting that mouse exactly where you want it to be. I certainly am that way, especially if I'm stuck on my laptop using the touchpad. I'm no good with a touchpad. I prefer a real mouse. And so there's another trick here that can be really helpful. And this is true for most of the adjustments that are available in Lightroom and in Camera Raw, etc., in that we can click into the numeric value. So the fields for the sliders over to the right, those are the numeric values representing the adjustment value. So in this case, for temperature, that happens to be the number of degrees Kelvin for the light that we're compensating for. And so I could type in a different number if I want this to be 5,500 Kelvin or 6,000 Kelvin. Except how many of us could guess what that number ought to be? Probably none of us, I'm guessing. But there's another trick here that is really, really helpful, and that is to use a keyboard shortcut to increase or decrease the value. And so I can press the up arrow key to increase the value and the down arrow key to decrease the value. Normally, up and down arrow changes a value by 1. But the Kelvin scale is much larger, and so we need to make bigger adjustments. So you can see we're actually making adjustments by 50 degrees Kelvin at a time as I use the up and down arrow keys. I can also make a bigger adjustment by holding the shift key on the keyboard while pressing the up or down arrow keys, which usually is a 10x factor, but not always. And so, it'll vary from adjustment to adjustment. In this case, it is 200 that it changes that value by. So I can use shift up and down arrow to make these big adjustments and decide, do I want to make it a little bit warmer? Do I want to make it a little bit cooler? And, I kind of feel like cool is more suited to this image maybe. So I'll take it down in that direction with shift up and down arrow. And then once I've gotten pretty close, now I can let go of the shift key and just fine tune up arrow, down arrow, and fine tune that overall setting until I feel that it's an appropriate value. And then turning our attention to the tint slider, same concept. It's just a different axis. So we're shifting between green and magenta. I don't hear too many photographers saying, I want this image to have a nice magenta color cast or a nice green color cast. Even if it's, a subject, foliage in the forest, for example, that we want to have lush green. We usually don't introduce a color cast in those colors. Usually tint is more corrective, dealing with problems in terms of that color. But, you could play the same game, but here you don't have to go very far before things start to look a little bit crazy, because these aren't the types of colors that we're typically looking for in terms of, a magenta cloud would probably scare me. Well, then again, so would a green cloud. And so we usually don't need quite as much of an adjustment. You almost could just jump directly into that numeric field again. So just click into the numeric field and just use shift up and down arrow to get pretty close. And I don't have to go very far before, well, that's way too magenta. And in the other direction, that's too green. So let's try and find a nice, neutral balance in between the two. And obviously, there's this sort of balance. In theory, we want accurate color, but I've not met too many photographers who actually want accurate color. They want believable color, but better than what nature provided. And so, you might have a tendency, and especially we tend to like warmer images, unless, something like this, I feel like the subject sort of is suited to a cooler, because literally we assign that emotion, that what we call a cool color, even though it's backwards in terms of the Kelvin scale, but what we call a cool color does have a cool mood, as in, not exactly warm and inviting versus yellow. So, you might prefer to take the image into a little more of a yellowish direction. We do have that flexibility. We just want to try to make sure that it's at least believable, that it's plausible that the color would have looked that way. Which, not always. You can just say you're an artist, not a documentary photographer, and you can do anything you want to your images. All right. The other piece of color that is gives us a lot of control as well, and can be helpful but also harmful depending on how we use it, is the saturation. So thus far, we've been looking at the overall balance of colors. Are we shifting the color toward one direction or another, where we're changing all the pixels to make them more yellow versus more blue within the image? But then saturation is a different matter, and saturation actually relates to the purity of color. So, we can think about the degrees around the color wheel, the hue being what we're working towards. So we're working toward the yellow hue or the blue hue or the green or magenta hues, for example. Saturation is purity. So the lack of purity means pure gray, and maximum purity means essentially primary colors, the most intense red, green, or blue, or the subtractive primary colors of cyan, magenta, and yellow. And thankfully, we have some better adjustments now, which we'll talk about in just a moment here, but that give us some self-control built in to the capabilities here. And so vibrance and saturation are the two sliders that we use in this context for boosting the colors or toning them down, as the case may be. Saturation is a bit of a blunt force instrument, and so I can take the saturation up and end up with an image that starts looking a little bit almost cartoonish, or I can take that saturation down and I end up with an image that looks black and white. This is not the best way to create a black and white image. It works, but it doesn't give you as much flexibility and control as using what amounts to the color mixer for black and white. But again, saturation it's a linear adjustment. It's adjusting the intensity of colors across the board to the same degree, to an equal degree. Whereas vibrance gives us a couple of advanced bonus features, essentially. It's still adjusting saturation. It's just got a different name because it's got a little bit of a different behavior. It is not just a linear adjustment. It is not causing all of the colors to be adjusted in the exact same way. In essence, I think of it as a saturation equalizer, at least when it comes to increasing saturation. It allows us to boost saturation with a little bit of self-control built in. And what it does is it puts the brakes on the saturation for colors that are already highly saturated. Or put another way, it applies a stronger boost in saturation to the colors that are not very saturated, the colors that need it. So here, for example, the yellow of the crop duster here is already pretty highly saturated, whereas the blue sky and the green hills, not quite so much. And so as I boost saturation, you'll see that even the airplane is getting a pretty significant boost in saturation. But if I instead use vibrance, I'm applying a stronger adjustment to the sky and the landscape than I am to the airplane. So we're sort of just equalizing colors, bringing the not so saturated colors up without messing up the highly saturated colors. Those higher saturated colors are still getting some adjustment, just not as much as the rest of the image. When we reduce the value, then we have kind of the opposite behavior, in that the highly saturated colors they're the last to go. They're the last to desaturate. So when I reduce saturation using vibrance, you'll see that I can get to the point where the image almost entirely looks black and white, but these highly saturated yellows are still there. They're just toned down somewhat significantly. The other thing that Vibrance gives us, by the way, in terms of that advanced feature, is that it protects skin tones. And so if you have, a picture, well, if you had a picture of me, then if you boost the saturation, I'm going to look sunburned. If you boost Vibrance, I'm just going to look like I got a decent tan. And so it gives us a little bit better control in terms of skin tones as well. But the general approach then that I use is to boost vibrance until I've got a good balance of colors in the image. And so that can involve a pretty strong increase in the value for vibrance. 20 is like a really, really modest setting for vibrance. It's not uncommon for me to take that up to, closer to 50 and sometimes more. And then you might say, well, yes, Tim, but this is too much. Yes, I know. But that's where the second piece of this comes in. And this is why, even though vibrance is way better than saturation, we still need saturation, if for no other reason than when we've used vibrance and gotten those colors balanced, but it's not quite right, we can tone things down. So I've balanced the colors, but we're oversaturated. So I'll just use a little bit of a negative value for saturation to mitigate that issue. So I can boost the colors with vibrance with some self-control built in. And then if that takes it a little bit too far, then just use a negative value. And this process is something that I use the vast majority of the time that I actually put the vibrance adjustment to use, because giving it a little bit of extra oomph and then toning down with saturation actually, in most cases, in my experience, gives us better color as that overall end result. All right. And then moving right along here, taking things a step further in terms of the degree of control that we can exercise over an image, and that would be the color mixer. And so color mixer enables us to adjust color, which might not sound that exciting because we've already been adjusting color, but it enables us to adjust color for individual colors. And so, for example, the red of the motorcycle maybe was, not quite right. It looks a little more kind of slightly orangish rather than like, fire engine red or what have you, or well, police motorcycle red, I should say. This is, I love that there's even police here because this is in Curacao. No, not Curacao, Kiribati, which is in the South Pacific. It's a tiny little atoll. I think there's something like 200 people that live on this atoll. But that's why the police had time to just sit there and look at the water, the beautiful water. So coming down into the color mixer section here on the right panel and going to the mixer tab, not point color, we'll come to that separately. We can adjust the color attributes for individual colors. I can change the reds, I can change the blues, I can change the greens. And so let's take a look at the sliders first. First off, we can configure how we want these sliders to
You can talk.
appear.
You can talk. It's on
It
you.
brings me to something else, and you wanted my date of birth.
Oh,
Date of birth.
Yeah, for you to go in to go.
there we go. All right, so first off is to determine which sliders do we want to see and how do we want them to be arranged. And I want to stress right from the start that changing how these sliders are displayed does not impact the adjustments. So just to illustrate that, I'm going to desaturate the reds just for fun. We'll come back to the actual adjustments here momentarily. So right now I'm adjusting based on HSL, hue, saturation, and luminance. Hue being degrees around the color wheel, saturation being the purity of colors, luminance being the brightness of the colors. But I can change that to color. But all that does is change how the individual sliders are grouped together. So under HSL, I have a set of sliders for hue. So red, orange, yellow, green. This should have been Roy G. Biv, for those of you that know the acronym, but Adobe made it a little bit different. We got aqua in there, for example, purple instead of indigo. But we have sliders for hue grouped together, sliders for saturation grouped together, and sliders for luminance grouped together. If I switch to color, all that changes, and I'm going to switch to all here for a moment, all that changes is the grouping. So now I have hue, saturation, and luminance for red. Notice the saturation for red is still desaturated, even though I made a change to how these sliders are displayed. So then I've got an HSL grouping for orange and for yellow and for green, etc. When I'm set to the color option here for adjust, I can view just one of those color sets. So here's just the blue sliders for hue, saturation, and luminance. Similarly, if I'm over here in HSL land, I can see just the hues, just the saturations, or just the luminances, or I can choose all. And obviously with the color option here, we've got colors instead of words, essentially. This last one being the all option. And for me, usually I like to work with the color setting here as opposed to HSL because usually I'm focused at any given moment on a specific color. So let me get the reds looking better, let me get the greens looking better, etc. And so then we can go ahead and adjust the individual attributes for each of those. So, but again, you can change the display. You can see only one color at a time. I like to have them all there because it makes me feel like I've got, more control over the color in my images. But then hue, think of it as degrees around the color wheel, except that might not make sense to a lot of us if you're not familiar with the color wheel and how that all works. But you can also just think of it as a variation on a color balance adjustment. It's just that it's a very narrow adjustment. So we can take the reds and make them a little more kind of pinkish, dragging here to the left, or a little more orangish. So I can shift just the reds and make them look a little bit different in terms of the color. So hue, so let's make that somewhere in there, maybe it's a little bit more reddish. And then saturation, the purity or intensity of the color, so I can boost or reduce the saturation for just the reds. And I can adjust the luminance. I can lighten or darken. Do be careful with luminance in the context of color adjustments because it can have a tendency to make those colors look a little bit kind of washed out or muddy if you take it too far. So, let's say something along those lines, maybe boost that saturation a little bit more, but we've adjusted essentially only the reds. And I can apply similar adjustments to any of the other colors in the image if I'd like. And so let's say for the yellows, for example, maybe I want to take those yellows, which is primarily the grasses out here, and I want to make them look a little more green. They forgot to water the grass here, so I want to give that grass a little bit of a watering, shift it toward more of a greenish, maybe a little bit more saturated, maybe a little darker. Just bear in mind that I'm not really adjusting the grass. I'm affecting the yellows, which most foliage tends to fall into a little bit of a yellow range more than green. The water, probably aqua and blue, I would assume. So I could, for example, go to my aqua section where I can shift between more green or more blue. And I can take the aquas, make them a little bit more blue, make them a little bit more saturated, maybe make them a little bit darker, etc. The greens, are we going to get a little bit of that? No, probably then just the blues. Yeah, there we go. So I can make the blues. That's mostly the colors up here at the top edge of the image, but also the shirts and, well, at least the guy on the left's got mostly blue shirt and pants there. And so adjusting the blues there is going to affect not just the water, but also the gentleman's shirt there. And so again, I can tinker with and, well, in this case, maybe start making a mess of the colors. But the point is that we've got this ability to control individual ranges of colors within the image so that, the red of the motorcycle wasn't quite red enough and the grass wasn't quite green enough and, the water wasn't quite blue enough or, whatever the case might be, we can get in there and refine those individual colors individually with good control, not great control, but good control. Great control comes later. But then first, I want to show you another consideration here, and that is just correcting minor little color problems. I'm sure many of you have had the experience of feeling that the adjustments on an image are never finished, that you could just keep going on forever. There's always some other thing that you can find. And when it comes to color, that usually means some of the just more nuanced color issues in an image. And this image has got one example of that pretty common if you tend to photograph landscapes, if you do a lot of outdoor photography, especially relatively wide views where you've got some haze off in the distance. The haze in the atmosphere will tend to refract the light and make it look a little bit more magenta. And so, for example, zooming in, let's go in a little bit closer here. Zooming in, to me, this cliff in the background here is a little bit too magenta compared to the rest of the rock. And so I might want to shift that. And so that's probably in this case going to be both my purple and my magenta sliders there. And so I usually will start with a reduction in saturation to get a better sense Oh yeah, there we go. That's mostly purple and probably a little bit, yes, some of that is magenta as well. And so you can see, take those saturations down, no more magenta. Well, no more color either. So obviously I'm not going to want to overdo it in terms of that adjustment, but I can just tone down the color. I can also shift the color into a little bit of another direction. So for example, let's reset both of these. I could take those purples and move them a bit more toward red, for example. So maybe use somewhere in there, take the magentas and do the same thing. I still think in this case, they both need to have their saturation toned down just a little bit. It is off in the distance. I do want it to kind of fade as, as these things do, but it felt like it was a little bit too pink. And so I prefer to tone that down in this particular case. So sometimes it's just like a really subtle, like let's see how well, if I turn off the visibility, so if I click the eye icon here to the left of color mixer, there's the before, and there's the after. Viewed from a distance, I still think that's a good improvement on the image. Call me a control freak. I am, but I still think it's a worthwhile adjustment to be able to take that color that, to me felt a little distracting. One of those things, as soon as I notice it, I can't stop noticing it. It's going to bug me. And so being able to fine tune and, throughout the image, maybe some of the greens we want to shift, probably they're a little bit more in the yellow front. Yeah, they sure are. So when we go to the yellow hue slider, if you pay attention to the foliage along the bank of the river here, then yellows rather, not green, taking that toward more of a green, you can see that we can make it look neon. Obviously, that's too far a shift toward green, or just want to tone down the saturation, or maybe darken it up, etc. Not that I feel the need to have a lush green grass along the side of the river here at Horseshoe Bend, but the point is that we can exercise that control over the colors. I'll go ahead and reset because it was looking okay the way it was, but that magenta in the distance was bothering me. So again, using the color mixer there to just fine tune individual ranges of colors. But what happens when your sort of definition of color, you might say, doesn't match Adobe's? This happens to me all the time. And fortunately, there's a tool for that, a new-ish tool that probably a couple of years old, maybe, I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. But Point Color is relatively new, all things considered. And it enables us to redefine what a color actually means, essentially. In other words, which color are we actually adjusting? And so in this case, for example, we have these kind of blue umbrellas, but we don't want to adjust the sky when we're adjusting those umbrellas. Or the green and the yellow are relatively close to each other. And so we want to be able to kind of isolate those individually. Whereas you may have even seen with a couple of these images, I'm adjusting yellow, but it's also affecting some of the greens because they're neighbors on the color wheel. So when we go to point color, we're able to define our own color. So it's not just, I want to adjust the greens, it's I want to adjust umbrella green in the image. So we can see here on the point color tab under color mixer that we have shifts for hue, saturation, and luminance. There's also a variance slider. This is brand new, by the way, in Lightroom Classic 15. And there's a range slider, but you'll notice that none of these controls are working. All of them are disabled. And that's because we haven't created a color swatch yet. I have to tell it that I want to adjust umbrella green, for example. So much like we saw with the color, the white balance, we can use, well, it's not the white balance tool anymore, but it's the eyedropper that we can sample a color with. And then I'll go sample a representative color within the image. Notice the loop there so that I can better see exactly what color I'm getting so I don't accidentally click on a black area, for example, or this, the text here. So I'll go get a representative sample green. This is the green that I want to adjust. So I'll click in order to create that color swatch. The color swatch is right here. You can create up to 8 of them, by the way, for different colors. So hopefully there's not more than 8 colors for the umbrellas here. And then I can shift the values. And so I can shift the hue, the saturation, and luminance. So it's literally the same HSL controls that we saw with our mixer under the color mixer. It's just that we are applying not based on Adobe's definition of a color, but by our definition of a color. And so I can shift the hue, And we're seeing just a little bit. It's spilling over into the yellows just a little bit, trying to see if there's any other color that it's being problematic for. Just a little hint of change that I'm seeing here for the yellows. And I'm also seeing that, for example, this umbrella is mostly getting adjusted. Let's see if we take that saturation all the way down. Yeah, I think we're still missing a little bit there. But take a look at some of these other green umbrellas, and they're not being affected at all. So my color sampler wasn't very good, I guess. So I need to refine the very definition of umbrella green. And the way we do that is with range, also with variance, which I'll talk about. It's a little bit more of a subtle shift here. But with range, the idea is I can expand the range or contract the range. So as I expand the range, you might notice that these green umbrellas are getting a stronger effect than if I use a lower value. So not a dramatic change, but a change nevertheless. But the range slider is not that helpful. It's a cool concept, but it's not that helpful. Thankfully, there's more. If we come over to the right here, there's a little triangle that allows us to expand or collapse the additional controls. So I can define the hue range, the saturation range, and the luminance range. So I want only colors that fall within a specific range on the color wheel, only colors that are at a particular saturation level, so just the highly saturated colors or just the relatively low saturated colors, and then based on brightness values. The controls here, a little complicated, but the idea is that the rectangle defines the range of colors, so the hues, the saturations, or the luminance, the attributes for the color. Anything that falls, any color that falls within this rectangle is being completely affected by my adjustment. In this case, getting desaturated, and with a hue shift. Outside of that rectangle, then we have these little pentagons here. Those are our slider handles. That determines the degree of feathering or transition. So the colors within the box are getting completely adjusted, and then that adjustment will taper off as we get closer and closer to the value out where the pentagon, the slider, ends. So I could tighten that up, for example, so that I've got less of a transition if I don't want to spill over into neighboring colors, for example. Similarly, for the saturation range, I can also expand the range. So I can make, if I grab the left edge of the rectangle here, or the right edge for that matter, so I can change the range of saturation levels that are being affected, as well as the range of luminance values. But how am I supposed to do this other than applying an exaggerated adjustment and tinkering with these controls? Thankfully, there's a checkbox for that. Visualize range right down here enables me to see only the colors that are being affected by my adjustment. So for example, I'm going to reset my adjustments right here. Just double click the slider handle. And then I can try and figure out, what do I need to do to expand to include these other values? So I'm guessing that I might need to expand luminance because I've got the sampling color was in the bright sun and these other umbrellas are in the shade. So I'm guessing that those other colors are possibly a little bit darker. And sure enough, as I expand the rectangle for luminance, we're starting to see the darker areas getting included a little bit better. I can also, let's do this the wrong way. I'm going to expand the hue range over toward the left. Well, neighboring to the left, so to speak, is the yellows adjacent to the greens. So you can see, oops, now I've gone too far and I'm including the greens, the yellows, I should say. Note that if I drag the rectangle to outward, so the left side to the left, I'll start pushing the slider for the feathering. But if I drag, in this case, the left edge to the right, if I drag only the rectangle inward, I'm leaving the feathering behind. And so in most cases, when I'm initially adjusting these ranges, if I want to expand, I'll always drag the rectangle. If I want to contract, I'll always drag the slider, the pentagon. So I'll expand, but then if I want to contract, I'm going to go to the slider handle down below and contract, watching the yellows in this case, and getting just to the point where that yellow basically changes to gray because of this visualized range feature. I might want to then expand that slider a little bit so that we've got a little bit of a transition so we don't end up with some transition edges that are really harsh where we abruptly go from a color adjustment to non, where especially if it's a very strong adjustment, that could create some visual oddities. Saturation, I don't imagine I need to expand, but let's see. Yeah, I'm seeing if I boost the range, if I increase the range of saturation to include the not so saturated colors, I'm getting some other areas included that I don't want, meaning that color is starting to appear. So I'm going to just tighten that up just a little bit, right about there, it looks like. And then, well, I think for luminance range, I do need to keep that pretty well spread out. Let's see, do I need to take the right edge? Yeah, I do actually need to keep that fairly broad as well. But again, what I'm doing is expanding or contracting as appropriate the hue, meaning the baseline color, green versus yellow versus blue, and then the saturation, the purity or intensity of the color, and then luminance, meaning brightness. And especially with the help of that visualized range, I can hopefully get those sliders such that I've got, in this case, all the green umbrellas appear green, and none of the other areas of the image have any color. Note, by the way, the little dot that appears inside the rectangle, that is the value for the original color that I sampled. I cannot move that dot. I would have to get rid of my sample and make a new one, for example. And I also can't drag a rectangle so the dot falls outside the rectangle because that is the color that I've sampled. That's the color I'm changing. So that color has to be included in the range. Again, if you've made a mistake, you can right click on the color swatch up here and choose to delete the swatch. But then once we've gotten that range adjusted, conceivably you can use these gradient controls. If you're comfortable with those gradient controls for shifting the overall color, totally fine. If you're not comfortable with that, you can click this other triangle right there to collapse those, and then just work with the hue, saturation, and luminance shift sliders so that I can make those, green umbrellas look whatever it is I want to do to them. Let's make them, even more green, a little bit more of a kind of emerald green, maybe a little bit darker, etc. And then variance, that allows me to adjust the adjustment effectively and mitigate it relative to other colors. So if I increase that variance, I'm going to start pushing into neighboring colors. And if I reduce the variance, then I'm going to start to pull that back so that I'm not affecting those other colors within the image. And so, tightening or expanding the range as the case may be. And then I can continue adjusting other colors. So, for example, pink and purple in this case, they're going to be pretty close to each other. So I might need to be really careful when I'm adjusting the range. So I could, for example, grab my eyedropper and sample purple, and I can grab my eyedropper and go sample pink, and grab my eyedropper and yellow. And what else did we miss here? The blues. Not that they're like super blue, but I could, adjust those. Let's see if we get, yeah, so there's the sky being included. And so the sky was seemingly a little less saturated. No, not quite. And I'm sure the hue is going to be a little bit different for that sky. But obviously, things that are blue, in fact, probably tighten up on the brights here as well. Let's see how we're doing. Still, yeah, as is often the case, blue objects and sky are going to overlap with each other. So that one could be certainly very, very tricky to try to get just right. But then with my multiple samplers here, I can click on a particular color. Ooh, and see, even with the purple, we've got a little bit of the blue there, but I'll bet we could tighten. Yep, absolutely. So see how now the sky, the color has faded. So there's a little bit of color for the sky. But as I tighten up the hue range, then we can get to the point where we're adjusting purples but not blues. And here again, I could fine tune saturation range and luminance range as well. But same basic concept as we've already seen here. And then I can adjust the actual color attributes. So, maybe make those purples a little bit more saturated, for example. So being able to get in there and exercise great control over individual colors in an image. Another tool that is tremendously helpful is an option for adjusting the hue, the saturation, and the luminance of colors, which might sound familiar because I've just been talking at length about hue, saturation, and luminance sliders. And the context for that was the color mixer on the mixer tab, adjusting hue, saturation, luminance for, let's say, Adobe's colors, or going to the point color tab and adjusting hue, saturation, luminance for our colors, the colors that we've sampled and customized within the image. But there's another way that we can adjust hue, saturation, and luminance in the photo in a somewhat targeted way, and that is with color grading. Same concept, but instead of focusing on specific colors within the image, we're focusing on tonal ranges within the image. And so we'll go down here to color grading, and you'll see that we have these fancy controls for shadows, midtones, and highlights. And similar to what we saw with Color Mixer, we can choose how we want to display these controls. So right up here for adjust, I can choose to see all three of those. I can choose to see only shadows, only midtones, or only highlights. Or I can use the global option, which is HSL, hue, saturation, and luminance adjustments globally for the entire image. Not just the shadows or the midtones or the highlights, but everything. In other words, it sort of replaces the temperature and tint along with saturation, in a manner of speaking. I'm going to start with global just to introduce you to the concept of what this adjustment does and how it works and how these controls work, because they're a little odd, I would say, potentially confusing. Not exactly the most user obvious, the user discoverability here is not necessarily all that great. But we can adjust the hue, saturation, and luminance. The hue, as I've mentioned, is degrees around the color wheel, and that's what this handle on the outside of the color wheel is for. I can drag that slider around the color wheel. So it's sort of like temperature and tint, except temperature is going from blue to yellow, back and forth across, not around the color wheel, but across the color wheel. With the hue slider, we're able to adjust degrees around the color wheel. But notice that as I'm spinning the hue slider around my color wheel, nothing is happening at all. And that's because we don't have any saturation yet. Saturation is this circle that's at, well, at least at the moment, at the center of the color wheel, but we can drag it outward. And as we drag it outward, we're getting more saturated. So if I take this inner circle and move it out toward the outside of the circle, that increases saturation. Toward the center of the circle, reduces saturation. And at the moment, notice I can use the saturation slider to adjust both hue and saturation all at once. So let's just say we want the image, we want it to be golden hour instead of blue hour. So we'll go over here toward the yellow, make it very saturated. Well, at this point, now that I've applied at least an initial adjustment, now it'll be a little bit more obvious that these are sort of individual controls. So hue is always only hue. I can drag that hue slider around the color wheel. Because my saturation has been boosted here, I'm actually seeing the change within the image. So that's hue outside the circle. And then saturation, now it's actually, at least mostly, hopefully, depending on how I do with the mouse, this is going to become only a saturation slider, because I'm just going to drag inward and outward from the hue slider to the center of the circle. So click and drag. Notice that I have this line. It's like a slider that goes from low saturation to high saturation. As long as I do a good job of following that line when I'm dragging with my mouse, my slider stays locked there. And so I'm, at the moment, only adjusting saturation. So I wanted to add yellow for golden hour. It's a little silly. It's not what I wanted to do here, but it's the example I'm using. And so I can add more of that color or less of that color. One of the ways you might think about this, it's like I'm taking a sheet of clear acetate that is color tinted. So now instead of just being clear acetate, it's a yellowish acetate sheet that I can still see through, put in front of the image, and now the image looks more yellow. Same, basic concept as that. But if I am not careful in how I'm dragging the slider, or if I intentionally choose that I want to have a different effect here, I can intentionally drag away from the line here, like so, and I'm back to being able to adjust hue and saturation at the same time with that single control if I would like. And then I have separately right down here a luminance slider. So think of it as the color I'm imparting to the image can be a bright color or a dark color. So it's not the same as like an exposure adjustment, but it will have an impact on the overall luminance, the brightness levels within the image. All right, let's reset that global adjustment because that was just silly, but it gives us a better sense of how these controls work. So then we can turn our attention to the shadows, midtones, and highlights. And for this image, my intent, the reason that I am so grateful that color grading exists is that I feel like this image needs some improvement in terms of color. To my eye, you can have a different opinion if you like, but it's my picture, so obviously I'm right. But to my eye, the shadows are looking a little bit too blue. But the cathedral, the Duomo here, is looking a little bit too yellow. Not dramatically, but when you want to exercise greater control, you got to nitpick the image a little bit. Well, blue and yellow are opposite colors. So if I shift the color toward yellow to try to make the shadows look better, that's going to make the Duomo look even more yellow. And if I shift the color away from yellow toward blue, that's going to make the shadows look even more blue. I need the opposite adjustment. Well, really, I just need color grading where I can apply this adjustment separately in different directions in this case for the shadows versus the highlights and maybe even the midtones if that were an issue. Most of the time, at least in this type of a context, I don't need to get to the midtones, but it's there if I need it. And so let's start off with the shadows. I want to take this toward a more yellowish color. And so I'll start off with my saturation slider at the center of the color wheel and just drag that toward a yellow value. And then, usually I'll just max out the saturation so I can evaluate the color a little bit better. And then we can take that color, the hue slider. There's, green versus yellow versus red. And I want it, in a yellowish tone that looks pretty accurate. So there, it's almost like I've neutralized that blue hour light for those dark shadow areas, but that's too much. That's overdoing it. So then I want to tone down the saturation for that area, essentially adjusting the strength of that color. So at the center, you see all the kind of bluish cast there. I want to just increase that saturation a little, not to make it look yellow, but just to kind of tone down the blues that I felt were just being a little bit almost distracting, a little bit too strong. I think that looks a little bit better. So then we come to the highlights, and I can again start off with a little boost in color. In this case, my highlights, the bright areas of the photo, primarily the Duomo in this case, I think looking just a little bit too yellow. So I want to take that over towards some shade of blue. So first I can find there's magenta versus green, and I want, some blue that just nicely offsets the yellow. And then once again, reduce that saturation and find, we can still look a little yellow. It's illuminated by light. So it's not that I don't like it looking a little yellow. I just don't want it to look dingy. So just kind of compensating a little bit somewhere in there, for example, where I've applied effectively the opposite color adjustment to the shadows versus the highlights. We also have a blending option and a balance option, but I'm going to demonstrate those. We certainly could use those on this image. There's not really, in this case, any reason to, I would say. There's no problem in the image that would take me to those sliders, but I'm going to show you what they actually do in the context of a different type of adjustment, just because it'll be a lot easier to understand how they work in that context. I want to, take a little bit of a creative meander here, essentially, with this color grading and show you some other scenarios where you might put it to use. And so here, for example, kind of a little bit of a touristy kind of shot, I suppose, and well, or trying to make lemonade out of lemons when the weather is not cooperating. And so this to me feels a little bit old-fashioned almost, like it's still funny to me that these binoculars are out there at, various viewpoints. Well, I guess especially for photographers who, we usually have some pretty decent focal length lenses, so we can just look through the viewfinder and check out the view. But point being is it looks kind of old to me, like it might be a postcard from the 1960s or something. And so maybe I want to give it a little bit of a color treatment that makes it look more like kind of an old faded film effect. And so, this is a color image, obviously a little dreary, not a whole lot of color, but, maybe for the shadows, for example, I want to give it just a little bit of a magenta tint, maybe doing like a Kodachrome type of, color effect onto the image, maybe just a little bit of a kind of greenish tint for the highlights. That doesn't need to be anything too strong, but just to give it a little bit of that film effect. You might have noticed, by the way, when I was talking about the profile pop-up at the beginning, that some of those had this sort of vintage look, but you can do this with greater control using color grading. And of course, you could also then use the midtone slider as well if you wanted a third color. I'll demonstrate that with a different image for a different technique here. But again, taking, in this case, not exactly corrective, quite the opposite, but adding a creative adjustment with the exact same capabilities. That color grading adjustment could be for a corrective issue or for just a more creative type of effect, including some interesting possibilities here when it comes to images that don't have color. And so, the previous two images were color images with color adjustments. I can actually convert an image to black and white, but still apply color grading to it. And so let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to switch to the black and white treatment option in the basics section there. So I've got myself a black and white image, come back into color grading. In this case, I just want a single color. So let's go ahead and use the global option, and I can impart a color. So we'll blast the saturation all the way to maximum and then drag the hue around and decide which color I think I want to go with. Maybe a sepia tone or a cyanotype or a retotype or whatever the case might be. So let's just go with kind of the cliche sort of sepia tone type effect, maybe somewhere around in there, but then reduce the saturation so that we're just imparting a little bit of color into the image. So kind of black and white, but where instead of using black ink, I'm using sepia tone ink, kind of a brownish ink color. But it doesn't have to be just a single color. And so if I switch to another image here, we'll also convert this one to black and white and then come back into color grading. I can take a black and white image and make a duotone or a tritone where I'm putting a different color in the shadows versus the highlights, for example. So somewhat common would be to use like a bluish for the shadows and maybe a little bit of a yellowish, warmish tone anyhow for the highlights, somewhere in that range, for example. Oops, sorry, I just went to the midtones, reset that, set that color for highlights here. Not too strong once again, maybe just a little bit brighter. But then I can also add a color for the midtones if I wanted to, so that I've got, well, let's say from blue to red to yellow, for example, or whatever colors I defined. But in this case, in part because I want to demonstrate a couple of other options here, I'm just going to reset that midtone color. So I've just got, in fact, let me make the color stronger here for the next step, just so that it'll be easier for you to see what's going on. So a little exaggerated color, but I'm going from blue for the shadows to yellow for the highlights. And that's where the blending and balance options come into play. Blending is a little more subtle, but the idea is, are we going to have an abrupt transition or a smoother transition for those colors? So again, a little bit subtle, but you can see here, in fact, let me zoom in just a little bit, see if this will be a little bit easier to see, where we've got, with a higher value, we've got these kind of like abrupt transitions from blue to yellow, for example, versus these colors that kind of just blend over a larger distance. And then the balance, so I'm going to reset and zoom back out. The balance is essentially defining where is the tipping point between shadows and highlights. And so if I drag over toward the left, I'm getting more of the shadow color. If I go all the way to the left, now it's only the shadow color, only blue. Or going in the other direction, increasing the value all the way, now it's only yellow. And so I can choose, do I want the image to be mostly highlight color, in this case yellow, or mostly shadow color, in this case blue, or where do I want to create that split between them for that type of a split toning type of effect. In fact, color grading used to be called split toning. It was different. So, it's not exactly apples to oranges, but like a red apple versus a green apple, let's say. And so this section was called split toning. The controls were completely different. Now it's called color grading, but it can achieve much the same result. I also wanted to make sure to talk a little bit about some targeted adjustments.
I have a
Because
can I ask a quick
yeah,
question
yeah,
before you
absolutely.
move on?
Absolutely.
And maybe I could have waited a little bit longer, but so you've given us like three areas mainly of adjusting colors. Do you tend to use all three, or do you tend to lean on one more than the other when you're adjusting your colors? For instance, do you go to the color grading more than you would the point color in the mixer? Or, is there, or is every photo unique? I mean, we're all looking,
Well,
quick, doing things quicker as well.
well, in my case, I mean, mostly I just get the color just perfect in camera, and then I don't even need to.
Ah, okay.
No, it's that temperature and tint always. Like, sure, you might go adjust them and end up where you started, but pretty rare. You're going to at least tinker in one direction or the other. So temperature and tint, every single image is getting that. Vibrance, every single image. Saturation connected to vibrance, more often than not, but that's a little bit more mixed. And then the real question becomes, color mixer versus color grading. And it does depend on the image. So it depends on the circumstances, the lighting, in terms of how those colors are getting rendered. So I would say color mixer, at least for me, I tend to use a lot more often than color grading, because usually sort of the scenarios there are with color mixer, it's the image looks good overall, but the vegetation's not quite right, or the sky's not quite right, or the whatever object. In other words, it's a color that's not quite right. Versus for color grading, it is generally like the shadows versus the highlights, and that's less common. In a daylight scene, it's not like you're typically going to have shadows that are really blue and highlights that are really yellow. It's usually going to be a fairly decent balance. And so if if you're trying to save time and skip one, probably color grading you could skip more often than color mixer. But color mixer, again, is just really it's kind of bothering me that this particular color is not quite right. So it's kind of basically, what's your motivation, right?
I've always struggled with the color grading, split toning, whatever. I'm more comfortable with the point color and the mixer.
Yeah,
Um,
and
and then I
color
don't know where the
grading,
calibration at the bottom. I don't know where calibration comes in.
it doesn't.
Oh, okay.
It can. I'll come to that.
All right.
So yeah, so color grading is usually going to be a lot more nuanced, because if you go strong with color grading, you can make the image look really weird.
Yeah.
And so color grading usually is really getting nitpicky about the color in the image, highlights versus shadows. And just if folks have seen me present on any of these subjects, if you've seen me talk about color grading, you've seen that Florence Duomo shot, because I don't need color grading very often, and it's frankly difficult to find images where it has a very clear, obvious benefit. Whereas, show me an image where there's one color that could use a little bit of refinement. Yeah, that's easy. I want the reds here to be more true red, and I want the rusty colors there to be a little bit more saturated, and I want my skin to look smoother. No, you know what I mean? Like, it's easy to find images where I want these greens to be more emerald green instead of whatever green this is. So when it comes to just this color could use a little tinkering, that's pretty easy. When it's like shadows versus highlights needing a different color adjustment, that's much less common. And it's going to be more common with night photos, by the way, where you're going to tend to have more of a mix of some natural light, like the blue hour shot of the Duomo, where we've got still some natural light plus some artificial light. And that's really what's causing most of the sort of competition there in terms of those colors.
Well, you've already helped me with one shot. I've got the horseshoe bin, it's almost identical photo, almost the same
Right.
spot you were in, and I got the
Right.
same vermilion color out there on the cliffs, and I could never figure
Exactly.
out how to get rid of it. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Color mixer is great for, again, that one color is bothering me. That's color mixer.
thank you.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. All right. And then, the other piece that I wanted to add in here in terms of color, especially, in the context of exercise and control, and then I'll probably shift to some of the new features, uh, assuming there's interest in seeing what some of these new features are. And also, Mike, actually, you have to let me know if we want to take a look at some of the non-developed features that are new, like assisted culling. Um,
Sure, whatever you feel.
Why not?
Yeah, roll with it. We're
Roll
open
with it.
to
There
we're
you go.
empty brains, absorbing knowledge here.
Right. Perfect. All right. So I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about masking, so targeted adjustments. And so here in the develop module. That's our little button over here in Camera Raw, which I closed that, but we've got the toolbar that's just vertical over on the side. So same basic concept though in terms of those buttons. And masking I could talk about for hours and hours, but we'll just kind of cover the basics here in terms of the concept where now that control goes a step further, where it's not just, hey, the blues don't look right or the shadows don't look right, but this specific area of the image, the landscape doesn't look right, or the sky doesn't look right, or this guy doesn't look right, or that car, or that airplane, or that mountain, or that hot air balloon, or whatever the case might be. So I think of masking as sort of like adjusting areas of the image based on geography, you might say. And what this involves is a mask, which is just a stencil. It's just a shape. So if I wanted to adjust just the hot air balloons in this image, I need a mask that's shaped like hot air balloons, not just any hot air balloons, those two hot air balloons. And then once I've defined a mask, once I've defined a shape, the area of the image that I'm adjusting, now I can apply adjustments. But with masking, it is a subset of adjustments. It's not everything in the develop module. It's just the adjustments that happen to be included in masking. That continues to increase over time. Hopefully, Adobe makes a more dramatic change here where we could have virtually everything available when we're using masking. Some of it, guided upright, for example, applying a transformation to the image, a perspective correction. Chances are I don't need to adjust the perspective of only the sky and not the landscape, right? So there's situations where the adjustment just really doesn't apply in terms of the concept of masking, but it'd be nice if we had a little bit of a broader range. But again, Adobe does improve this over time. And with our mask shapes, there's some options that are completely automatic, that are sort of semi-automatic, and that are completely manual. And again, I'm just going to talk about some of the basic shapes here for our purposes, just to kind of introduce the concept of masking. I can come back another time and talk about masking in much greater detail. But for example, I can identify a key subject. So let's go with this one. Let's see how it does. So I'm just going to click subject for my new mask. It analyzes the image and it does a pretty good job. You see it missed part of the horizontal stabilizer here, a little tiny bit of the vertical stabilizer. It went a little beyond the fuselage there into the background, but otherwise looks like it did a pretty darn good job. I can always improve upon this. I can just use the brush to paint and add areas to my mask, etc. But once that mask is defined, I can apply my various adjustments. I've got most of my tonal adjustments, my basic color adjustments, including a hue adjustment. So one of the questions I often get when it comes to the color mixer, for example, especially point color, is like, well, but those sliders, they only let me go so far. What if I want to dramatically change the color of an object? So for example, let's try subject here. Select subject. Perfect. Well, this is going to be silly because I selected entire hot air balloons, but then if I come down and adjust the hue, I can take these hot air balloons and make them, just about any color of the rainbow. Obviously, all those colors are getting a similar adjustment, so it's going to be, it's all purples, but it's a similar range of bluish purples versus, kind of oranges and yellows and greens, etc. But I can change the color of an individual object. And see if there's a better example of a particular subject like that. So I can make adjustments, apply adjustments based on that particular area of the image. And these automatic options usually do a pretty good job. Let's try background here. Pretty good. And maybe I just wanted to, kind of darken the non-car areas of the image a little bit, for example. And so, obviously this gives us all sorts of capabilities, but part of that is to apply better color adjustments. So, we're focused on color adjustments first and foremost here. So if I wanted to shift the colors here, well, I could go to point color and adjust the blues just for the sky, but I can also apply a masking adjustment. So I can select that sky, and then I can, make that sky more blue versus yellow, more green versus magenta, more saturated or less. Unfortunately, we don't have vibrance here, at least not yet. I can also just add a color. So when I talked about color grading, I use the analogy of a sheet of clear acetate that we make it, a little bit yellow or a little bit blue. Well, we can do that type of adjustment. In fact, let me just reset my sliders here, and I can click on my color swatch, and I can choose any color of the rainbow. So this is literally that kind of global adjustment, except only for the sky that we saw with color grading, and I can apply any color that I would like to. So maybe I wanted, to use a little bit of a kind of a warming filter type effect, or kind of a more golden hour type of effect. In this case, just for the sky. And so we've got the luminance and the hue represented here. So hue is left to right, luminance or saturation, I should say, not luminance. Saturation is up and down, but we also have a separate saturation slider. So if you change your mind altogether, you can set that saturation back down to 0, and there's no effect being applied to the image. So we can leverage masks if we need to go beyond that level of control that we have with something like the color mixer or the color grading adjustments, and including, if we go, let's just go to this little tort here. I could, if I wanted to, exercise even greater control by, for example, just using the brush. Typically, the way we would do that, in fact, let's go back to the balsa glider here and go back to our mask. So I've got my adjustment. Let me just make a exaggerated darkening adjustment here. So you can see that I'm missing part of the vertical stabilizer there, missing the horizontal stabilizer here. Well, I can go use other tools to build up my mask, to build up this shape. So I need to add this area to my mask. Well, I can go to my existing mask, and then I have add and subtract buttons down here. So I need to add to the mask. Well, let's add in what shape? I don't think any of these are going to work any magic for me. So I'm just going to have to go with the brush. So get my brush tool. I can turn on auto masking so that it'll sample the color within my crosshair and look for the edge of that object within the circle. And so I can click, and that's not working all that great. You can see I'm applying that adjustment elsewhere. So then I'm going to have to go, wow, full manual mode. So I'll turn off auto mask and erase. So I'm going to switch to my erase brush rather than the A or the B brush. And I'm just going to do a quick sloppy job here just to illustrate the concept. I can get in here and clean up. And so here I've applied an exaggerated adjustment. I can also turn on the overlay if I want to see that color. So I can see, here I need to kind of clean up that mask a little bit more. And, here it needs to be added to, etc. And so, depending on how strong our adjustments are, that will determine the degree to which our mask needs to be perfectly accurate. If it's just a subtle little adjustment, then I don't need the mask to be perfect. But if it's a really strong adjustment, then I'm probably going to have to spend time to make that mask as perfect as it possibly can. So in this case, if we switch back to my A or B brush, and A or B, it's just a way for me to have two options to choose from. So here, for example, a smallish brush with a moderate amount of feathering versus an even smaller brush with tiny feathering. So I can just change the settings for A or B individually so that I can switch back and forth between a large fuzzy brush and a small crisp edge brush, for example. So let's go with the smaller one because I just need to paint in this little area here to add that to that mask, etc. Again, obviously, I'm not painting perfectly within the lines, but just to illustrate that concept that we can build up that mask. And, including being able to do some relatively sophisticated things. So in this case, for example, maybe I want the sky to be adjusted, but in a little bit of I want to boost the saturation, but I want it to taper from top to bottom. So I'm going to start off with a sky mask. There we go. And let's just shift the hue wildly and boost the saturation wildly so we get an obvious effect here, just so that we can better tell what's going on with my next step here. And then I can, in this case, subtract. So let's say I want the top of the sky adjusted more than the bottom of the sky. So I can use a subtract option for this mask of a linear gradient, just a straight line gradient, like a graduated neutral density filter type of concept. And I can drag, in this case, upward from the bottom. So notice I'm subtracting. So only the sky is being affected. Now I'm subtracting from the bottom portion of that sky so that I'm getting a tapering type of effect. So, let's say maybe something like that. And so now as I shift the hue, you can see that I'm having a stronger effect at the top of the sky versus the bottom of the sky. Obviously, maybe somewhere in that general vicinity might be more believable. There's also, for those of you that take pictures outdoors, anybody, there's an option. There's a pretty cool option actually for a landscape. So since this is a landscape, I'm going to click to create a new mask here. And we're going to choose our select landscape. And this actually is, I guess, sort of semi-automatic because I still have to give it one more piece of information in the next step, but it's mostly automatic. So select landscape, the image gets analyzed, and we see the components that were determined to be there. So sky, well, okay, that's an easy one, and we could have just used the sky mask feature. The mountains, and actually it did a pretty darn good job of isolating the mountains. And then the vegetation, which includes both the mountains and the vegetation in the foreground. There are various other options. I'm surprised actually now I have to remember what it was called. I think it's like natural ground or something to that effect that might also be found. So the options you see will vary based on what the analysis concluded. And so, for example, here, there's some water. So maybe it can find water. Let's try the landscape option. So I'm going to just make a new mask for landscape. And you'll see our options here: sky, water, but also architecture. Even though it's called landscape, it still finds non-landscapey stuff. This might seem weird in the context of landscape, except, for example, did I have a picture of the barn, of a barn? No, I don't have the barn photo here. But, a barn out in the middle of the rolling hills of the Palouse, that's going to be architecture. So it doesn't have to be a city skyline. It could be, some structure out in the mountains, for example. And then I could just turn on a checkbox for whichever components I want to make that mask for, create that mask, and now I have a mask, an adjustment that affects only the skyline in this particular case. There's even an option for people, by the way. So if I go to a picture of a person and go into the people section, it will detect a person, but then I can pick and choose what portion of the person. And this too, it will vary. So does it have facial hair? No, right? No. So even though I was, let's get an option here that will leave it there. I did have a little 5 o'clock shadow going there, but it wasn't long enough to be determined to be face hair. But I do have hair on my head. And then there's facial skin versus body skin. So I could adjust those individually, or I could turn on the check boxes for both and make a single mask that is comprised of both of those, or I can make a mask for each of those individually. Eyebrows and the eye sclera, the white of the eye, iris and pupil, lips, teeth, hair, clothes. And I mentioned facial hair, and I'm trying to think what other ones are missing here. But anyway, the point is that what's available there will vary depending upon what was detected within the image. And I mean, there's more. There's a lot more in terms of being able to, create various shapes. Well, let's do a luminance range just for kicks, since we were talking about adjusting the shadows versus the highlights in an image, for example. And so I can go to my range option here. Color range, obviously, color. So, just this blue value. So this is very much like point color that we saw with Color Mixer. Luminance range. Depth range is for images captured in portrait mode, like on an iPhone, where you've got a depth map so that you can determine distance, not very accurately, but distance from the lens. Um, it's not great, but it gets better with each iteration. Meaning it's not great on the part of Apple creating that depth map in the first place. But with luminance range, this is sort of like the controls that we saw when we were adjusting with point color. It's just that here we're talking about luminance range rather than color ranges. And so I can have only, there we go. I can have only the highlights be affected, only the very, very brightest highlights, or only the darkest shadows be affected, and I can fine tune that range as needed. So do I want, just the windmill, for example, or just the clouds, etc. And then obviously apply adjustments to those areas based on, so, just to give a quick example there. So I can adjust, make those storm clouds. But again, applying based on these different possibilities. So let's see, was there anything else that would be really cool to check out? So the subject, identifying hopefully the key subject, which, if there's a clear subject, it usually does pretty good. The sky, the background, which is more or less the opposite of the subject, but not exactly. So you will get different results with both. They're not literally the inverse of each other, but they're pretty similar. And we can, if one or the other does better, you can always invert the mask. So sometimes, for example, you might be better off using select subject, and inverting might give you a better result than background. Landscape we took a look at. Select objects, that's just where we can essentially identify an area that we want Lightroom to look. So when I go to select objects, I can either draw with a brush or I can draw with a rectangle. I'll just use a rectangle here. And I can say, go find an object in this area. Boom, it does a pretty good job. And so I've got a mask for just the smaller, well, the more distant hot air balloon. And I mentioned brush, linear gradient. Radial gradient's just an elliptical shape rather than a linear shape for the gradient. And then the ranges we talked about there. So again, just options that give us some pretty good control when the color adjustments, color mixer, and color grading aren't giving us the degree of control to find exactly the object that we're trying to adjust, the area of the image we're trying to adjust. Masking gives you kind of maximum control in that regard. And then I did want to mention new in Lightroom Classic 15 is dust. This has been available for at least a few months, somewhere in the 3 to 6 month range in Camera Raw, but it's brand new to Lightroom Classic, and that is automatic dust removal. And so you can see, some dust spots. I'm sure you can see quite clearly. There are many of them in this photo. But if we go to the remove tool, we have the remove tool itself where we can paint on objects in the image, but now we also have this dust option under distraction removal. So I'll show you a few examples of distraction removal just to kind of give you a taste if you haven't already. So again, dust is new. I'm going to just turn on the apply checkbox. It will process. And it did very well. You might notice there's a spot it missed right there. This little bright spot to me is a blemish. I would have cleaned that up, but it did not. But as I hover over, notice all those little circles of all the dust spots that it found, and all completely automatic. One click of the mouse on that checkbox, and we can apply. We can also click on an area and adjust, so we can change the size of an area that we're painting, and we can paint over areas. We can select and refresh a particular area. So if one of them, it didn't do well, this one I need to click on to make it clean it up to begin with. I can reduce that size, but we can also refresh for any of those if it didn't do such a great job. So not a ton of control, but oh my goodness, what a time saver. Obviously, hopefully it goes without saying that my sensor is never this dirty. I usually joke that I had to painstakingly paint those dust spots in Photoshop, but sadly, and this was on a trip where I was only using a single lens, so I didn't even have the excuse of having changed lenses. Also in the distraction removal, people. So just to kind of showcase this is not brand new, but it is pretty impressive. And so we can just go into the people section. It will find the people and put an overlay here. Notice actually there's probably a person in the window there. So it's got those people pretty well selected, including their reflections. Then I can just click the remove button. Let's see what happens. Amazing. So we've got people removed as if by magic. So I'll turn off and on. Oh, well, okay. It was looking amazing until I noticed right in here where what was an ATM became a cabinet blocking access to the window where you order your donuts. But still, in most cases, works pretty remarkably well. And then also reflections. Again, not new, but since we're here in distraction removal, I thought I'd give you a couple of examples. So obviously a pizza joint with pizza by the slice available, but lots of reflections here. So in the reflection section of distraction removal, turn on apply. amazing. And we have a strength control here as well. But, some of these, some better than others, they'll vary in terms of how well they work from one image to the next, but still pretty darn impressive. So yeah, just the dust part of that is new. One of the other features, it's not implemented great yet. Maybe something like this. But we can now zoom when we're cropping. So you didn't used to be able to zoom while cropping. You were just cropping and that's all you had. But now we can zoom while we're cropping. The problem is that the Navigator preview updates based on what's cropped. And so I can't just navigate around the image very easily. I'd have to like scroll around the image in order to go find, the slider. Let me unlock my crop there. And to find my margins. And so it's a little bit clunky. I'm hoping they'll update it so the navigator can be used in the context of cropping. But the point is that we can now actually zoom in while we are cropping. I mentioned the variant slider that's new for our point color adjustment. And I'm trying to think, well, the only other thing, I know we're just about wrapped up here, and I'll be happy to take some questions in the last few minutes that we have as well. But assisted culling would be the other kind of, significant new feature. And it's of limited utility for the moment. I would say it's mostly just useful by and large for portraits, not exclusively, but that's where it's mostly aimed at the moment. So if you're not a portrait photographer at all, you might find it a little less helpful. I'm sure it's going to change over time. But if we go into the assisted culling section of the library module, then we can choose how we want to identify selected photos versus rejected photos. And so, for example, the subject being in focus, the eye being in focus, the eye is actually being open. So you can see, obviously, for portraits, this is aimed at primarily. And then reject documents and receipts. So it's a little bit of a silly one, but for example, if you're using your iPhone to take pictures of travel documents and whatever, you can have those automatically rejected as photos you might not want in Lightroom Classic. Misfires, so if the lens cap was on, that type of thing. And then exposure issues, so dramatically over or under expose. So let's go ahead and at least turn on. Well, I wonder if it will think any of my photos are misfires. I might not want to know. But so I've specified my criteria. For focus, both subject and eye, there's sliders. So we can say, no, it's got to be really, really sharp, or, we can be a little bit more relaxed about it. And then the results will be that photos are selected or rejected. And so you can see a little green with a check mark or red with an X. And I can hover over those to see my scores. There's also a culling scores section over here that shows what the score was. And so if I select a photo, see, a subject out of focus. Is that really true? I'm not sure that's necessarily true, but maybe. So that only got a 62. The eyes were, I love the subject's out of focus, but the eyes are in focus. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but okay. And eyes are likely open. I imagine my eyes are probably open for most of these. Eyes in focus, 100. Subject out of focus. Misfire for blur, just the background. Well, maybe the face too. But in any event, that we get these scores and we can apply our results accordingly. So once we've gotten images marked, then we can also either stack the images or the organization here, batch actions. And so I can apply, a reject flag, for example, or a particular star rating to the images based on. This can be done, by the way, both during import into Lightroom Classic or later in your workflow here, as we can see. Same basic concepts, just, different approach, different timing in your workflow, essentially. So I would say still in its infancy, and especially notice that it says here early access. That's Adobe's code for, we don't really think this is finished yet, but we wanted to include it so that we could say we included it, and so we can get some more feedback from people to see how, what's working and what's not working. The other thing that I'll mention is that these icons will cover up the missing photo exclamation point. And so you've got to turn off the culling feature. So I would need to, turn off my checkboxes here so that I'm not actually seeing those marks up at the top right in order to see the exclamation point. I'm hoping that Adobe will fix that. There's some things that are a little bit clunky about how the culling works and then the interface aspect of it. So hopefully there will be some improvements. Well, I know there will be some improvements. Hopefully the improvements I want will be updated as well. All right, happy to open it up to questions if applicable. And I'll mention once again, I do have there'll be a webinar on Monday the 17th, question and answer session, so you'll be able to submit questions. So if you want to tune into that, you're more than welcome to. Just point your web browser to timgray.me/webinar2511, and there's a registration form there. Totally free, but more than welcome to join if you'd like to tune in. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so why would anyone still use Lightroom whenever you can do all of this stuff in Camera Raw?
Well, when it comes to the develop module, then there's not a good argument for Lightroom versus Camera Raw. And in fact, the argument for Camera Raw would be that you're getting access in some cases to features a little bit earlier than everybody else because Adobe has taken that little bit of a shift. The primary advantage, I would say two key advantages to using Lightroom Classic rather than Camera Raw. One is that it's a little bit more of a cohesive environment. Camera Raw is sort of an interstitial step, kind of sort of between Bridge and Photoshop, or opening an image in Photoshop. First, we've got to go through Camera Raw, then get to Photoshop. Slightly clunky, not that that's a really big deal. But the main advantage is the catalog, which is also the main problem with Lightroom. Why have so many photographers gotten into a mess in Lightroom Classic? Because of the catalog. But what the catalog enables is a lot faster searching for images, locating images by a wide variety of criteria. And so, for example, this catalog only has 168 images because just a demo catalog, so not much to it. But I can filter, I can say, show me all of my 5-star rated. Wait, where'd my 5-star images go? I can filter based on specific criteria, star ratings, and color labels. The more valuable pieces of that is, show me everything that every image I captured with the 10 to 22 millimeter lens, where the shutter speed was a 3/50th of a second, or whatever. Obviously, with not even 200 images in this catalog, this isn't the most interesting demo of the filtering feature. But the point is that my actual catalog has almost 400,000 photos. And I can say, show me all images that were captured at f/16 or f/22 with, shutter speed of 30 seconds with focal length of, whatever, and I'm filtering instantly in real time. Whereas with something like Bridge, because there's not a catalog, if you just browse a folder, you've got to wait for the attributes to populate, and it takes a lot longer. And if you wanted to filter across your entire hard drive full of images, hundreds of thousands of images, it's going to take forever. And so, for many photographers, they'll hear that and say, so what? Like, that doesn't benefit me. I've got my folder structure is dialed in. I'm able to find the image that I need. And so, it's either meaningful or it's not. But beyond that, there's not a tremendous advantage to Lightroom Classic. And, my feeling is that if you're not already using Lightroom Classic, I would only start if you consider yourself a technically savvy person, because it's so easy to get into a mess in Lightroom Classic. My most popular video course ever is cleaning up your mess in Lightroom Classic. So thank you, Adobe, for using the catalog. The catalog is great as long as you don't mess it up. But it's so easy to mess it up. If you make any changes to your folder structure, if you rename anything or move anything outside of Lightroom Classic, it's missing in the context of Lightroom Classic. So it's really, really easy to get into a big mess if you don't know how to properly use Lightroom Classic. So if you're a little nervous on the computer, stay away from Lightroom Classic. And bearing in mind, Camera Raw and the Develop module, basically the exact same thing, just a little bit of interface difference. So there's not a huge advantage. I would say the advantage is compared to Bridge, rather than Camera Raw, for example.
Thanks.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right.
No, thank you for a great presentation.
Oh, thank
I
you.
would probably be one that needs to take your course on how to get out of a mess in Lightroom, but it's working okay, but I do find myself tangled up sometimes. So that's definitely a course I will look into.
Yeah, and I, one of the things, if you start with an empty catalog, depending on which view you're in, Lightroom will display a message, click the import button to begin. That is the worst advice they could have ever given you. The first step to using Lightroom Classic is go learn how to use it. Go read a book or watch videos or, phone a friend, right? Because you've got to understand that catalog and how to protect it, meaning everything needs when you're using Lightroom Classic, everything must be initiated in Lightroom Classic. Never use other software to start something. You can send
Right.
images from Lightroom to Photoshop, or to plugins, etc. But everything starts in Lightroom Classic. Break that rule and you're going to have problems. And the problem is Adobe never told you that rule. So,
Yeah. I
Right.
like being able to round trip. I start out in Lightroom Classic, then I
sure.
want to finish off something in Photoshop, and all I
Yep.
gotta do is hit save, and it puts it right back into Lightroom Classic for me,
Right. Exactly.
and pops Lightroom back up where I can continue with other photos from the shoot. So
Absolutely.
I find that to be an advantage as well as hunting for photos. I can't remember what year or where I was, you
Yeah, and
know.
the way I describe it in terms of searching in Lightroom Classic is whatever you can remember about your photo can probably be used to locate a photo in Lightroom Classic.
Yeah.
The same theory applies to Bridge, but unless you know for sure which folder to go to, it's going to take a lot longer with Bridge. But again, some photographers are really good about their folder structure where they know exactly what folder to go to. Now they just need to find, the 5-star rated image, in which case Bridge can work perfectly well. But yeah, it's the organizational side where Lightroom has the most potential advantage, but that does come with some pitfalls if you're not using it properly, for sure.
Yeah, I was looking for a photo from Sedona the other night, and I've been to Sedona 4 times, so which I couldn't remember what year or when. So I
Right.
literally went through every Sedona folder. But
Yeah, and you could just select all the Sedona folders. So I can click on the first folder and shift click on the last folder in arrange.
yeah,
And now I'm browsing, in this case, all 4 of those folders. And so, whatever, again, this particular catalog doesn't have a ton of images, but here's the 24 to 105 at an 8-second shutter speed or 30-second shutter speed, or 1/30th of a second, I should say. So if you know the details, you can browse multiple folders or you can browse all photographs. So I'm looking at my entire catalog. That can be tremendously helpful. Especially, if like me, sometimes your search is a little bit esoteric. It's like, I know that's got a starburst, so it's probably f/16 or f/22, and I know I use this particular lens, but I don't have much else to go on. So that can be really, really helpful. But again, you've got to be familiar with the issues related to the catalog,
yeah.
or you'll get into trouble for sure.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been such great information tonight, and I hope
Thank you.
I polled the club on some of the topics that you and I had talked about earlier, and this I think was right down Main Street of what they were wanting to see, and
Cool.
would love to have you back next year for a
Yeah,
section
absolutely.
on masking. Uh, that I think the thing that's really becoming very good with Lightroom, which is where I do 90% of what I do, is now you can mask to a certain thing and then change the color. You
Exactly.
don't
Yeah.
you don't have to worry about all the blues in the sky. I can just do the blue sign on the side of the road,
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
with a mask and then go to point
Yep.
color.
And then, and Photoshop's got to be more. So in Camera Raw, you've got the same masking features that we have in Lightroom Classic. But then when you go into Photoshop proper, now you've got all these selection tools and masking tools and the ability to manipulate those masks directly. And it just opens up a whole other new world of potential in terms of exercising control over your images.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else got any other questions before we let Tim go?
No, but Thank you much, Tim.
My pleasure. Thank you, everybody.
All right.
You.
We'll see you again another time for masking.
We will.
Sounds good.
Thank
That'd be
you.
great.